This video is made possible by my wonderful patrons. Check out the link at the end of the video or in the description if you'd like to join.
And the interaction of the water molecule with biological structure, that it's all happening at the scale or at the level that is consistent with the Planck field and its coherent behavior in that region of space.
The man you're currently watching is Nassim Haramein, a self-proclaimed physicist with multiple published scientific papers and foundations in his name. In his video, he is discussing the arc crystal, an invention that he claims will somehow alter the structure of water and help with the human body in both better hydrate itself as well as just extract the energy from the vacuum. Sounds pretty impressive. Below the video, we see a comment left by a viewer and fan of Haramein, Mike. He comments,
"Can we see some more evidence on the arc crystal benefits? I want to believe so bad, but $1,200 is an entire paycheck for me. My wife's health has been a struggle for over 5 years, and I want to know if an arc crystal can help her."
A pretty reasonable request. Mike seems to be in quite a predicament, one that many of us have found ourselves in the past couple of years, as capitalism moves into its late stages while a pandemic is raging. Barely able to provide for their families, God forbid something bad happened to a loved one. So yeah, I can understand the desire to look for something, anything, to help. Enter the French admin of Haramein's company, the Resonance Foundation. This man, Hugo Charles, replies to Mike with some good news.
"Mike, the arc crystal has the ability to help your body to extract the energy from the vacuum thanks to its structure and its dynamic. You do it every day, but if you're sick or have a disease, it means that this natural dynamic is not at its best. Disease can be defined as a lack of communication between these parts. The arc crystal can help to restore its natural ability."
Wow! So according to Hugo, the arc crystal might be able to help Mike's wife with her... He never even said what disease she had. So it doesn't even matter. It's panacea. Quick, someone call the WHO. Sarcasm aside, this is illustrative of my problem with Haramein. He and his company are willing to sell these crystals as a miracle aid. They're willing to put people into debt by offering payment plans for $1,000 hunks of rock. They're willing to skirt science by publishing their own research in pay-to-play journals and pass it off as the real deal. What happened to Mike and his wife? Do you think Haramein and the Resonance Foundation ever followed up? What is it about Haramein that makes him so dangerously believable to the general public? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at in this video. But first, a word from my lawyer. She insisted that I put this in here for reasons that should already be apparent.
Hi, I'm Meromorphic's lawyer, Geraldine Golden. I got my law degree from Harvard, and when I say Harvard, I mean the Wendy's next to Harvard, by the dumpster out back, from a magical crackhead named Unicorn. Would you like to buy some of my lawyer crystals? Oh, right. All the statements within the video are strictly the opinions of Meromorphic, except for the math. That shit is wicked bad. What? It is.
Physics is hard. I think we can all agree on that statement, right? That's why physicists like Michio Kaku and Neil deGrasse Tyson make the big bucks. They're able to streamline it, make it understandable to the layperson, and make them feel like they're really learning physics, even if it only amounts to surface-level facts. I always thought physics was hard enough, and thus the barrier for entry high enough to keep out the grifters, and to keep the crystal healing and homeopathy types away. Boy, was I ever naive. A crop of these so-called amateur physicists have been popping up over the past decade or so, and now the social media savvy ones are getting larger and more vocal followings. Dan Olson over on the Folding Ideas YouTube channel made a great video about a group of them who made a movie promoting the geocentric model, the medieval idea that the sun and the entire universe revolve around the Earth. The video showed how these people were able to trick some actual physicists into appearing in the movie through some honestly deviously clever tricks.
You don't say, "We're making a movie proving that the Earth is the center of the universe." You say we're making a movie about changes in our understanding of the Copernican principle, or we're making a movie about the history and future of cosmology.
Flat Earth dominated the internet zeitgeist before the conspiracy nuts moved on to QAnon, and there was no shortage of self-proclaimed experts that fed into that nonsense. The thing is, in general, a layperson could fairly easily discern that those people weren't actual physicists. Their ideas were kind of out there enough, and their credentials shaky enough that anyone with an ounce of critical thinking capability would immediately see through them. But with those people came some more clever hucksters, ones that know enough to sound convincing to make their bona fides look legit. One such person is Nassim Haramein. His website, the Resonant Science Foundation, established all the way back in 2004, claims in big bold letters on the front page that he is, quote, a world leader in unified physics. The word unified here is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Traditionally, you'll hear about unified physics or a theory of everything, TOE, as a hypothetical means of uniting quantum physics with macroscopic physics, such as relativity. As it stands now, the two regimes are separate. Equations that work perfectly well on the human or planetary scale completely break down when at the size of an electron, and vice versa. So a unified theory would introduce some means to bridge that divide. However, Haramein uses the term a bit more freely to both include the traditional definition, but to also imply that it means that we're all connected in some spiritual way to everything else in the universe, which is, of course, something that he has no empirical proof of. So throughout this video, when you think of unified, think of the latter definition, because that is usually what he means. That is his whole shtick and the worldview that informs all of his research. Haramein established multiple organizations and institutions, including the Resonance Academy in 2014, which is a, quote, unified physics online learning platform educating thousands of students from more than 80 countries. He also founded Taurus Tech, LLC, which, according to the same website, is a private laboratory dedicated to the development of resonance-based technologies. Finally, in 2017, he established Arc Crystal LLC, which sells the aforementioned Arc crystals, claiming that they, quote, produce life-enhancing benefits resulting from an increased energy coupling with the structure of the quantum vacuum. More on this later. Point is, the guy has been busy establishing foundations, making movies, and hawking rocks.
Now, they're minerals! Jesus, Maria!
But what are his actual qualifications? What degrees does he hold? What education did he get that allows him to make such radical claims? Because, see, as a person who spent a long time in physics academia, I can tell you that one of the first things to go is your pride. You are humbled by the brilliance of the greats like Lorentz, Gauss, and Nethers. You worship at the altar of the Hamiltonian, and you are forced very early to realize how incredibly little you actually know. I learned a lot in my time, but I think the most valuable lesson I ever learned was to not speak on topics that I'm not extremely well versed in. It's kept me out of hot water so far. So anytime a physicist makes a bold claim like they are a world leader, I immediately look for their credentials. Well, it turns out that Haramein has none to speak of. The only thing his website says about his education is that he has, quote, spent more than 30 years researching and discovering connections in physics, mathematics, geometry, cosmology, quantum mechanics, biology, and chemistry, as well as anthropology and archaeology. Wow, that is an awfully wide variety of subjects. If he were doing legitimate research in all of them, he truly would be one of the smartest people of our time. As science progresses, it tends to push towards higher degrees of specialization. Topics become so dense with so many avenues of research that any one person hoping to learn everything there is to know, even just about all of one subject like physics, is totally unfeasible. So to claim that you have, honest to God, done real research in all those fields is laughable. Unless by research you mean typing archaeology into Google Scholar. Everything I've been able to find just seems to point to the fact that Haramein is self-taught. That in and of itself doesn't completely disqualify him from being able to learn and do real physics. In point of fact, Anyone well-versed enough and with the right resources can submit a paper to a scientific journal, and as long as the science is sound, they can be published. However, it is a sort of a red flag to look out for, as people with a passion in physics and scientists in general usually want to learn from experts in their fields. As the saying goes, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and the best way to get a piggyback ride is to ask the giant directly. So what about Haramein's publications? There are many publications listed on his site, and if they were published in legitimate peer-reviewed journals, that would be a point in his favor. Unfortunately for Nassim, this is where things really start to fall apart. Let's look through them chronologically. His first couple papers were published with co-author Elizabeth Rauscher. Rauscher is an interesting character. Unlike Haramein, it seems that she has a legitimate background in physics, achieving her PhD in 1978 and later working for NASA, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and others. However, she is also a self-proclaimed parapsychologist interested in psychic healing and the paranormal. Haramein's and Rauscher's first two papers, The Origin of Spin, yada yada yada, and Collective Coherent Oscillations of Plasma Modes and blah blah blah, were both published in something called Beyond the Standard Model, Searching for Unity in Physics in 2005, which is not a journal I've heard of. After doing some digging, it appears this is a record of some sort of conference proceeding, though it seems nobody that has this text for sale even has a picture of the damn journal. So, not a great start. Rauscher and Haramein's third paper, Spinors, Twistors, Quaternions, and the Space-Time Torus Topology, was published in the International Journal of Computing Anticipatory Systems. Just from the name, this does not seem like a journal that focuses on rigorous relativistic physics. Also a journal I have never heard of, which is something I think I'll be saying a lot. Why do scientists care about the journal a paper is published in? Simple. Accountability. The large, well-known journals like Nature, Physical Review, and Physics Letters are generally transparent and supported by the best and brightest scientists. They are also heavily read and scrutinized by scientists all over the world every hour of every day who use the information within in their own research. Because of this, their peer review process is intense. From experience, I can tell you that getting a paper published is a long and arduous process that can take months or even years in some cases. In a university setting, drafts are usually written by a professor, sometime with the aid of their research assistant. They are then sent around to everyone credited for input, editing, and clarification. Only after multiple back and forth cycles will the paper be submitted to a journal, where it will then be read and scrutinized again, starting another round of back and forth between the publisher and the author. Almost always, the first time it gets submitted, the paper will be rejected with notes to fix something, edit a line here or there, or even just start over if the premise is badly flawed. Back and forth until finally a finely tuned piece of science is produced. And even after it gets published, it is scrutinized by other scientists in the field, all looking for a way to either add to it or disprove the claims made. The International Journal of Computing Anticipatory Systems, I know nothing about them. Their peer review process, how many times their papers are cited in other research, which is usually a sign that the information within was useful, called the impact factor. We'll get back to that later. Publishing in such a journal, and again, I cannot stress this enough, one that doesn't even specialize in physics is a bad sign. From there, in what is the final collaboration piece between Rauscher and Haramein, they published Scale Unification, a universal scaling law for organized matter in the Proceedings of the Unified Theories Conference. Again, another conference proceeding. Now, these aren't always bad, but they are generally less rigorous than actual journals. What they are, in fact, are papers submitted which the authors give a talk on at said conference. The papers are then bundled together and published as a journal. In general, with exceptions, one such in just a minute, if the organization is well respected, then the conference papers are usually okay. That begs the question then, what is the Unified Theories Conference? Well, I honestly do not know. I did quite a bit of searching, and the only thing I could find is the Grand Unified Theories Conference, held by the American Institute of Physics, which is a well-known organization. Perhaps that's what Haramein meant. Perhaps it was a typo. While there is a copy of the proceedings available on Amazon, I wasn't able to secure it before releasing this video to verify. Either way, as we will soon see, Haramein was able to publish one such paper in an AIP journal that is absolutely bonkers anyway, so I think the point is moot. As far as I could find, the only paper that Haramein has published outside of a pay-to-play journal is the Schwarzschild Proton, published in the American Institute of Physics, or AIP, conference proceedings. As I said before, conference proceedings are not normal scientific journals. They aren't subject to the same rigorous peer review as other journals. However, there still is one. Also, it's still under the AIP umbrella, and they are a reputable source in general. So how exactly this paper got published in that journal is beyond me. Future Meromorphic here to interject with some info that I missed when writing this script. So it seems that the conference was not directly held by the American Institute of Physics. They just published the proceedings. Instead, it was a conference on computing anticipatory systems, which I believe is the exact same entity as the paper I previously discussed. As a background, computing anticipatory systems talks about artificial intelligence and systems theory, which has absolutely fuck all to do with relativistic or quantum physics research. Not only that, but the participants at the conference were there for the computing systems talks, and were most likely not physicists themselves. So to say that the paper was peer-reviewed is so much of a stretch that I suggest Haramein get his back checked for any slipped discs. The Schwarzschild Proton is written in a way reminiscent of a child playing with their parents' office supplies. In the same way, Haramein mimics some of the language and format of a legitimate scientific paper, but there is no substance to it, and in fact, he makes many contradictory or downright verifiably false assertions. So, what is this paper exactly? Well, overall, it seems that Haramein doesn't like that the strong force is a separate fundamental force, and he thinks that it can be explained via gravity. He thinks that protons, and ostensibly neutrons, although he doesn't say it explicitly, are actually tiny black holes. He thinks that those two facts are the smoking gun of a unified physics theory, and that it also means somehow all matter is connected in some spiritual way. I don't know. There are enormous leaps in logic in here. There's no way I could go through all the things wrong in this paper, as there are just so many, because not only do they continue, but they compound upon each other, as the paper uses flawed logic as the foundation for even more flawed logic. So let's just look at some of the highlights, and I'll start at the beginning. First, he starts by mentioning the concept of the Planck density, and says that, quote, "It may have significant physical meaning at the quantum level. As you may know, on the human size scale, the universe behaves in a way we are familiar with. Throw a ball, it flies through the air and falls to the ground, etc. However, down at the smallest lengths, masses, and even densities, things start to get a little funny. The universe is no longer deterministic, but instead probabilistic, subject to uncertainty principles. The ball may fall, or it may not. We have to measure it to find out." That's not a great example, but you get the picture. So the Planck density is the highest density, in other words, how tightly packed matter is in a volume, the highest density possible before space-time starts to break down and quantum gravity is required to explain what's going on. So, yeah, Nassim, the Planck density may have some meaning at the quantum level, in the same way that Jeff Bezos may have a hard-on for making his employees piss in bottles and die in tornadoes. It's a well-known fact, is what I'm saying. Next comes the first real step of this paper. Haramein decides, for some unknown reason that he doesn't explain, to calculate the amount of vacuum density necessary from the quantum fluctuations to produce the Schwarzschild conditions. What the hell does all that mean? Basically, he's saying, hey, that Planck density thing is pretty neat. What if that's what protons are? What if that could create a black hole? He gives no justification or context to why he's going down this rabbit hole, and call me crazy, but I kind of feel like that is necessary when he's taking such a huge f***ing leap off the deep end. Those are really big assumptions to make. A proton is a black hole? What? It's not an accepted fact that he can just drop without explanation. What makes him think that a proton is made up of vacuum fluctuations only? How does that account for its charge, or its spin, or the neutron for that matter? Why would he just assume that it meets the Schwarzschild condition? That is, in as few words as possible, the condition that creates the event horizon for a black hole. Basically the radius where if light passes in, it will no longer be able to escape. In fact, nothing will. That's a really weird thing to just assume. Usually this type of theory would come after some sort of measurement that would lead one down this path, not just some arbitrary shot in the dark. But sure, whatever. Haramein first calculates the quantity of density of the vacuum available in the volume of a proton. He calls this R sub p. This is just a really bizarre way of saying mass. That's all this is. He's calculating mass here. Density times volume equals mass. But the fun has just begun. The result he gets for the mass of a proton is 4.98 times 10 to the 55 grams. That is a really big number, like really, really big. Remember, this is just mass we're talking about, and that mass is way bigger than even the mass of a star or a galaxy. It's actually almost on the order of the mass of the entire universe. Does that make sense to you? You are made up of literally octillions of protons. That's 10 to the 28 number of protons in your body. So you alone would have more mass than the entire universe. Oh, but don't worry, that's not actually the mass he uses for his later calculations. Don't ask. After that, he shows a different calculation that leads to the exact same result, as if that somehow is meaningful. The really funny thing is, it's actually just the exact same calculation as the last one, just couched in different variables at first. But break it down, it's identical. So yeah, no f***ing wonder you get the same result. Reading this really makes me feel like I'm about to have a stroke. Next, he says this absolutely batshit sentence.
This may be an indication of an ultimate entanglement of all protons through the vacuum fluctuation.
Just what? What does that mean, Nassim? He tries to use these huge concepts to wow the reader, but he's all flash, no substance. You can't just drop a bomb like, oh hey, maybe all the protons in the universe are somehow connected to each other, and then not explain it. Finally, the paper just really comes to a head when Haramein employs the classical Schwarzschild condition in concrete terms, as well as Newton's second law, all on protons. Simply put, this is where the paper turns from weird and circular to just straight up wrong. He uses the Schwarzschild equation when looking at the scenario of two protons orbiting each other. Again, he gives no real attempt at explaining why he is looking at this first scenario, other than saying that it somehow mimics an atomic nucleus. But it doesn't really matter because of one simple fact. You can't just use classical mechanics on an inherently quantum system and just expect it to work out. That's the entire reason the field of quantum mechanics exists. We didn't just make it up on a whim, and it isn't some buzzword that you can stick into the beginning of your paper and proceed to ignore. So the actual mass of the proton that Haramein finds with this method is a much more reasonable 8.85 times 10 to the 14 grams. Just, like 9 with 11 zeros after it, in kilograms. That's like literally 100 Great Pyramids of Giza. That is literally the same mass as all the humans in the world combined, which are made of protons. Weird way to tell us that we need to lose weight, Nassim. He then does some other really dumb shit, like calculate the velocity of what one of these protons would be, and acts like it's a revelation when it works out to be the speed of light. Except from the equations he used, it of course works out that way because he explicitly is just solving for c, the speed of light. I don't even have the words to describe how dense that is, but I'll do my best in the next section when he pulls the same shit again. Not to mention, he uses an equation for velocity without showing its derivation or mentioning where he's pulling it from. The final nail in the coffin is that Nassim claims that all of these calculations show that two protons will have a stable orbit with each other, despite literal experimental evidence showing exactly the opposite. In the paper Experimental Evidence of 2 Helium Decay from 18 Neon Excited States, actual scientists, Ricidi et al., shows that such a configuration of two protons decays in less than a billionth of a second. Less than a billionth. I don't think I would call that stable. At this point, I really just couldn't go on any further. Really, there was no point anyway, since again, the entire foundation of this paper is just so wrong that any conclusions drawn from it are absolute nonsense. And at this point, do you see? Do you see how bad this guy is at doing physics? Are things still confusing to you? Did some of what I explained here go right over your head? Well, don't feel bad. Again, that's the point. That's exactly what makes this man so successful. He knows just enough to seem like a scientific authority to 99% of people. He knows that writing and publishing papers gives him street cred, and that it literally takes a background in physics to fully parse his work and disprove him. So he has nothing to worry about from the vast majority of his audience. And anyone that does try to challenge him just gets shouted down by the crowd. The next paper Haramein published was Quantum Gravity and the Holographic Mass. His website touts this as his seminal paper, supposedly the most important one he's published. The paper itself was published in 2013 in the journal Physical Review and Research International. A jaded person might be suspicious that this journal was trying to pass itself off as Physical Review, a real, well-regarded journal, by using the similar name. Not me, though. Definitely not. A quick Google search of this journal shows that it's published by a company called Science Domain International, who actually publish many different journals in different fields. Science Domain International also appears on the famed Beall's list of predatory journals. Let me just really quick explain that one. A librarian at the University of Colorado named Jeffrey Beall maintained a list between 2008 and 2017 of journals that were so-called pay-to-play. In other words, these journals would not perform real rigorous peer review, but rather just publish anyone who could pay the open access fee, hence the name. These journals are a real nuisance to the scientific community because they tarnish the reputation of decent open access journals, which are themselves an attempt to democratize science and remove it from the nasty paywalls which hurt everyone in the end. Not enough time, okay. Unfortunately, Beall was reportedly forced to remove the list from his blog due to legal defamation threats, even though it was very well regarded and widely known in the scientific community. However, if you're interested, copies of Beall's list as it existed in 2017 can still be found online. So yeah, this journal aggregator, Science Domain, who owns the journal that published Haramein, was included in Beall's list. Now, from what I have read, in the last few years, Science Domain have tried to become more transparent and increase the rigor of their peer review process, possibly due to the bad press they got because of the list. However, Quantum Gravity and the Holographic Mass was published back in 2013, back when Beall's list was still active, meaning it most likely was not scrutinized to the proper degree by actual physicists, if it was reviewed at all. To dissect this paper, I am going to employ the help of a blog written by a gentleman and real physicist, Bobathon, which is the name he uses on the internet. Once a well-known critic of Haramein, Bobathon dissected much of his work in his blog, which I have an archived version of linked in the description. Why is it archived and not available today? Oh, well now, we'll get to that in a bit. So what is this paper about? Well, it tries to, once again, unify quantum gravity with relativity, this time using the holographic principle. By doing so, Haramein claims to have calculated the charge radius of a proton, basically just the radius of a ball with equal charge and mass of a proton. Now, the holographic principle is a real thing derived from string theory and supposedly a property of quantum gravity. As described by the great Dr. Leonard Susskind,
the three-dimensional world of ordinary experience, the universe filled with galaxies, stars, planets, houses, boulders, and people, is a hologram, an image of reality sighted on a distant two-dimensional surface.
If that doesn't make much sense, don't worry. I don't really fully understand it either, and it doesn't matter because apparently neither does Haramein. Though he talks about it in the paper, he doesn't really use it. Importantly though, the holographic principle, just like string theory itself, hasn't yet been proven by any experimental evidence. Neither has it been disproven, simply because we aren't able to devise experiments yet to properly test it. The first thing I will say about the actual meat of this paper is that it starts out kind of okay. Contrasted with the moon-brained insanity of the Schwarzschild Proton, the first couple pages were actually coherent here, for the most part. Nassim, if you're watching this, and I know you are, considering the close attention you've paid your critics in the past, if you went to a real university and learned the proper maths underpinning physics, you could actually be a decent physicist. It's clear from your papers that you know what you're talking about in a lot of places. So please, for everyone's sake, stop this charade, get a degree, and do some real physics for a change. Anyway, that little island of coherence abruptly ends when he starts doing his own math. Without going into too much detail, he calculates something that he calls the holographic mass of a specific black hole out in space, which he says is equal to a combination of a ratio of volumes over a ratio of areas, multiplied by the Planck mass. Surprisingly, this so-called holographic mass, when calculated, actually matches the real mass of the black hole in question. Except there's one tiny itsy-bitsy problem. If you work through all of this algebra salad, as Bobathon so eloquently puts it in his blog, there is actually nothing new here. The, quote, holographic mass is the exact same equation as the Schwarzschild mass that Haramein quotes earlier in the paper. It's just Haramein using the exact same tricks that he used in the Schwarzschild Proton. Let me explain why this is dumb and bad with a simpler example. Let's say I came to you and said, hey, I found a novel way to calculate the area of a rectangle. Well, we all know the formula for the area of a rectangle is length times width. But in my novel method, we are going to replace length and width with new variables. We'll call them Blanc and Blorp. Blanc is length divided by 2, and Blorp is width multiplied by 2. Now we just multiply Blanc and Blorp, and wouldn't you know it, it gives us the exact same answer as the traditional formula. I'll be damned. Except, wait a sec. If you actually do the algebra, you'll see that the 2's just cancel each other out, and all you're left with is the original formula. So, no shit, it gives you the exact same answer. This is exactly what Haramein has done both here and in the Schwarzschild Proton, only in a more complex and opaque way to obfuscate the obvious fuckery. And seeing as how those are the only two papers I delved into, I would imagine he does this elsewhere as well. This is not new physics. That's just rearranging a formula from a paper written in 1916. So now he has an equation for the holographic mass, and he moves on into the next section to calculate the same thing. This time not for a black hole, but for a proton. But wait, Nassim, I thought that you said that they were the same thing. Didn't you already calculate the mass to be 885 million tons in your last paper? Oh well, I'm sure that the result this time will be the same. Otherwise, you'd just be contradicting yourself in your very next paper, and you'd look pretty silly, right? Right? But hang on again, because in this section, he doesn't even use the equation for the holographic mass that he had derived earlier in this very paper. He derives this new equation. Why? 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 Why is he doing this? He never gives a reason why. Literally, the whole point of not only this paper, but his entire body of research is to find a theory that unifies the small with the large, yet he immediately abandons it for apparently no reason. Well, actually, there is one, and that is because if he'd used the previous equation, it would give him a number he doesn't like. Eventually, though, Haramein derives a quantity he calls the charge radius of the proton. Now, this is a real value that real scientists have tried to measure, but there's no reason to think that what Haramein has calculated is that. Hell, charge appears nowhere either in the equation or the derivation. As Bobathon observed, this is actually a disguised version of a well-known quantity called the reduced Compton wavelength of a proton, only multiplied by a factor of 4. Briefly, this is the wavelength that a photon would have if its energy were equivalent to the mass of a proton. And there is absolutely no reason to believe that this has anything to do with the charge radius, nor does Nassim even seem to be aware that this is what he has calculated. The only thing that Haramein can latch onto is that it turns out this number just so happens to be close to the charge radius, numerically. Or actually, it's close to one measurement of it. See, there isn't yet one accepted value for the charge radius, as it's still an unsolved puzzle in physics. Over the years, there have been multiple attempts to experimentally measure it, but the two main examples are fairly different, and neither is the accepted value. Haramein has simply cherry-picked one such experiment, claims that it's the best without providing any reason or evidence, and says, "See you guys? Numbers are the same." Granted, it's kind of interesting that these values turn out to be so close. I'll give him that. Hey, Nassim, when you get your education, maybe think about looking into that, bud. You might have something interesting there. So yeah, all in all, quantum gravity and the holographic mass is once again circular algebra and buzzword nonsense. I hope that I've done a decent enough job in explaining why that is. Though again, check out the link to Bobathon's archived blog. He has more material there and goes through more of Nassim's papers. Following an addendum to quantum gravity and the holographic mass, Haramein has published two final papers, both in 2019. Not even going to look at the addendum because there's no way it fixes all the flaws as deep as were in that paper. It was like, oops, all flaws. First was the paper entitled Resolving the Vacuum Catastrophe, a Generalized Holographic Approach, published in the Journal of High Energy Physics, Gravitation, and Cosmology. When clicking on the link from Haramein's own website, we are taken to a page hosted by Scientific Research. After doing a little digging, I found that this company, Scientific Research, is somewhat similar to the previously discussed Science Domain International. It's a company that publishes tons and tons of journals in all sorts of fields. And if Science Domain International was sketchy, then Scientific Research is downright awful. The company has been accused of using email spam to solicit papers for submission. Although it has an address in Southern California, according to Beale's list, it is a Chinese operation. In 2014, there was a mass resignation of the editorial board of one of the company's journals, Advances in Anthropology, with the outgoing editor-in-chief saying of the publisher, "For them, it was only about making money. We were simply their front." So not a good look. In addition, in 2010, the company was found to have basically stolen research from scientists to pad out their own journals. But possibly the funniest of all was that in 2012, Scientific Research's journal, Advances in Pure Mathematics, was caught accepting a fake article generated by a computer program that spits out scientific-y papers. These fake papers have the format and look of a real paper, but reading even the first paragraph will make your brain hurt, because it's literally just meaningless gibberish, kind of like Haramein's papers. Finally, the last paper, The Electron and the Holographic Mass Solution, was published also in 2019 in the journal Physics Essays. The journal's website is honestly pretty amateur looking, and they proclaim themselves as, quote, the elite journal since 1988, so they haven't been around for very long. That in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. From what I can find, Physics Essays isn't embroiled in a controversy like the last journal. However, they are known for producing some very fringe, questionable articles. One of the best ways to judge a journal that you're unsure of is by looking at its impact factor. This number tells us how many times an article from that journal is cited in a given year. This is important because all good physics is built on what came before, which means that new research will have to cite old research, which can be tracked. So having many new articles cite old ones from your journal means that they have impacted the field in a positive way, that they have really progressed the science. As a rule of thumb, the best journals have an IF of 10 or higher. Good journals are above 2 or 3, and anything below 1 is questionable. It isn't by itself damning, but it isn't good because it means that the research the journal is producing isn't being used by anyone, so it's had very little to no impact. Given that context, the impact factor of Physics Essays hovered around a 0.25, and I say hovered past tense because the journal is now defunct. It is no longer published. And I'm not sure if that means that it's no longer being tracked, but for right now, Scopus and the Web of Science group says that the impact factor is not applicable, meaning it has none. So that is not very good. Now, I want to draw a pretty clear line here. While I think I pretty successfully eviscerated the Schwarzschild Proton and quantum gravity in the holographic mass, I haven't actually proven anything about the rest of his papers, since I didn't actually look at their content here. All I have done for the rest is to show that they were published in some very questionable and in some cases ethically bankrupt journals, who do very little in the way of peer review. However, I do think that all of the information together paints a pretty damning picture of how scientifically rigorous Mr. Haramein actually is in his work, and really calls into question his right to call himself a physicist. I was first introduced to Haramein's work last year when my sister feverishly told me about this awesome physicist that she had found. She had been reading his work and watching his videos, and genuinely thought that I would like him. Now, I should say that I was immediately suspicious because my sister is a bit out there. She is the personification of the saying, "I'm not religious, I'm spiritual." However, at the same time, my sister is far from dumb. In fact, she is very intelligent. And that right there is exactly why Nassim Haramein is so damn dangerous. Unless you have a degree in physics, it's very easy to fall for his presentation. Here is a guy who, yes, makes some outlandish claims, but then shows his work, publishes papers in scientific journals, and all of it reads as real to the uninitiated. Even a naturally intelligent person like my sister might be suspicious of his claims at first, but then reads his research, not having the tools to parse all of his circular, nonsensical math or truly understand how outlandish some of the things he says in those papers is, because it's all couched in a very real, very formal framework. Haramein has to know this. There is no way that an individual with as much apparent knowledge of physics as he has doesn't know how circular his own math is. He had to construct it in the first place, so yeah, it reads like a very intentional and honestly disgusting grift. How he was able to convince actual physicists like Drs. Elizabeth Rauscher and Amira Val-Baker, I will never be able to understand. Because as we have all clearly seen, the physics, the math, it's just flat out bad. How could we expect non-physicists to be safe when even they fall for the con? But if his presentation and research is the pit that is easy to fall into, it's the shit that he's selling, like the art crystals I mentioned, which are the sharpened stakes at the bottom. Of course, Haramein isn't just doing this research for the good of humanity. No, he has to hawk his useless wares at his unsuspecting victims. That's the whole point, you see. If you navigate to his site, the Resonance Foundation, you'll see many things on offer, such as online courses teaching about their so-called unified physics. Examples of these courses include fractal anatomy, with prices of either $298 or a whopping $498, or quantum healing with raw food for a mere $150. You can't even see a course overview without forking over the money, which I really can't do right now, but I'm sure everything is top-notch. They even mentioned resonance here. Drinking game idea. Watch one of these people speak and drink every time the concept of frequency or resonance comes up. But maybe do it with something light because I don't want to be responsible for anyone going to the hospital. And then finally, the big cash cow is once again the Arc Taurus crystals. Now this video is already really long, so I don't have time to do a proper examination of these guys. If this video does well, I will do a follow-up with a really detailed analysis on these crystals. But for now, the ARC stands for Advanced Resonance Kinetics. Drink for resonance. They claim that
the ARC crystal has a highly coherent interaction with water, positively structuring water at the molecular level, increasing its intrinsic bioenergy and making it more bioavailable.
And
as the biological organism is a hydrodynamic system, wearing the ARC crystal establishes the coherent connection between the body and the vital energy of the quantum vacuum.
Like, what the does that even mean?
It's fucking nonsense. Yes. It's also why it's hard to say.
Yeah. All of this is just technobabble of the highest order. It is absolutely meaningless garbage and has no basis in reality. The structure of water is H2O. That's it. It's a liquid, which is a highly disorganized jumble of molecules all sloshing around against each other. If you made it coherent, in other words, not a jumble, that would be ice. Coherent water is just not a thing. Better yet, if putting a crystal next to water changed the water's structure in some meaningful way, it would be immediately on the front page of Nature or one of the big journals, because it would probably have a ton of other uses besides making your water more watery. But because of all this, these crystals that Haramein is selling are way more predatory and dangerous than your average mall strip sage selling amethyst or whatever. Once again, he has backed up all these claims with very real-sounding science for anyone that isn't well educated in the field, meaning like 99% of the population. And boy, do these things cost a pretty penny. A single art crystal with a pendant is a whopping $1,350, while the pendant alone is $350, meaning that they think this little crystal, which of course they never show the actual structure of, they think this little crystal is worth $1,000 when most likely they grew it in a batch of them for pennies. Oh, but I'm sorry, it has titanium inserted in it because reasons. The one saving grace so far is that I haven't seen any claims that these crystals can cure COVID, so there's that, I guess. If all that weren't enough, though, looking online turns up very little in the form of criticism for Haramein, the random Quora post or a Reddit r/physics thread. And not because he's some fringe scientist. As of this video, he has nearly 900,000 followers on Facebook. As I said, at one time there was a physicist and blogger under the name of Bobathon who wrote detailed criticisms of Haramein and his work. Yet searching for it now will turn up mentions of Bobathon's blogathon, but the actual site, the actual blog, is nowhere to be found, unless one utilizes the Wayback Machine. So for this video, I actually got in contact with Bob, and when I asked about the disappearance of his blog, the reasoning made my blood boil. Apparently, between the years of 2017 and 2018, Bob was hounded by Haramein's lawyers, threatening defamation suits, among other things, for the critical posts on his blog. Now, I have linked a web archive of the blog below so you can read for yourself, but there is nothing in there that would warrant that kind of response, unless your goal was to shut down all valid criticism of Haramein's science so that you can continue your con. At the end of 2018, Bob took the blog down. Thing is, the Wayback Machine still exists, baby! And US laws are much more lenient, so I have absolutely no problem linking to it myself, because it stands as an impressive collection of great scientific criticism for anyone looking. I have omitted the actual conversations with Bob here out of respect for his privacy. So, unable to stand the heat of an actual physicist showing why his papers held no water, Haramein used his influence and money gained from grifting unsuspecting people to shut his critics up. Really let that sink in. Perhaps that's why nobody else has bothered to offer up the same level of criticism elsewhere. Not only all of that, but Haramein and co. actually created their own blog in response to Bobathon, a criticism of a criticism, very Digital Homicide-esque. They accuse Bob of being obsessive and question his credentials all because of his constant criticism. All of it reads as a very desperate attempt to deflect back onto Bob, like, no you. So I'll just end this section with a comment from Bob left on the response blog to his original blog. It took me like 10 times to say that correctly, so give me a break.
If you put forward a theory, it's good to have other perspectives available to anyone wishing to study it. There's no reason to feel threatened by its diversity.
Often, when debating with people like Haramein or his followers, they will say that mainstream physicists are just too close-minded, that we just can't accept these radical new ideas because it would invalidate so much of what we think we know. But while I do think there is a point to be made about some in the scientific community being too eager to stick to the status quo, overall, that simply isn't true. The physics and scientific community are just too large, spread across the entire globe, with too much diversity in opinions, ideas, religions, experiences, etc. Physics is not a monolith. Newtonian mechanics was, for 3 centuries, the explanation for how everything operated in the universe, until Einstein shook the community with his theory of relativity. And while at first some physicists were reluctant, Once Michelson-Morley proved that there was no ether permeating space to bend light, and experimental evidence was overwhelming, everyone got on board. Now it's just accepted. The proof, as they say, is in the pudding, and Haramein just doesn't have it. He's trying to manufacture such a shift with nothing but his own charisma, which, I think you know, is not how science works. I think we have pretty comprehensively shown why Nassim Haramein should not be trusted when he claims any sort of scientific breakthroughs. That he is a fraud and that he knows better, but still cons people into believing his nonsensical claims and buying into his worthless worldview via courses, memberships, books, and expensive-ass crystals. I know it may seem like just some physics dude ranting about some other physics dude, but this guy is defrauding people out of their money and selling them a lie. Albeit a nice-sounding lie, but one that still leads them astray from the truth. And in a time with COVID denialism, flat eartherism, QAnon cultists, and all the other conspiracy theories out there, we really can't afford that as a society. Now, I hope it goes without being said, but I do not want, nor do I approve of anyone harassing this person. Some of the things we've talked about may make you angry. Hell, all of it makes me angry. But we need to channel that in productive ways, and brigading him or his channel is not that. Please share this video with anyone you know that may be going down this path. Maybe they aren't yet a fan of Haramein, but with his large influence in the pseudoscientific spiritual world, it's only a matter of time. Not only that, but much of what I said focusing on Haramein can be applied to many other grifters in the exact same way. Stay safe out there. Keep your sense of skepticism and never be afraid to tell someone when they're flat out wrong. Until next time.
The three-dimensional world of ordinary experience. No, I fucking hate it.
This may be an indication of an ultimate entanglement of all protons through the vacuum fluctuate. God damn it. I almost had it.
Fluctuation.
Fluctuation.
Fluctuation.